Imagine I'm a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt, and I've just been given the most unsettling task of my entire career. Before me, on a cold marble slab, lies the wife of the pharaoh. But this isn't the usual process of mummification. I've been ordered to preserve her body in a way that breaks every sacred ritual I've ever learned, and the reason sends a chill straight through me. This isn't some story invented for effect. This was reality in Egypt, where intimate customs could be so extreme they would shock even the most open-minded modern person. You think you know Egyptian civilization? The gold, the proud pharaohs, the mysterious pyramids? That's the version you hear. But there's another side you won't find in school lessons. In Egypt, there were practices so extreme that Victorian-era archaeologists went to great lengths to hide what they found. Royal children could be subjected to horrific abuse, and religious celebrations often spiraled into days-long orgies of violence and excess. What I'm about to share could shatter your image of one of history's greatest empires. The truth was so disturbing that museums around the world concealed it for more than a century. From 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, along the fertile banks of the Nile, customs emerged that would astonish even the most liberated modern minds. This wasn't only about pleasure or sacred ritual. It was a deliberate tool of power, a way to control the cosmos and enforce political dominance. Pharaohs were seen not just as rulers, but as living gods. Their sexual vitality was believed to decide the Nile's floods, the success of the harvest, and even the survival of the kingdom. That belief drove them toward increasingly extreme public displays. We know this not from the sanitized temple carvings shown to tourists, but from hidden inscriptions, papyrus records too explicit for public display, and discoveries Victorian scholars either destroyed or locked away. To the Egyptians, sexual energy was cosmic energy. Every act of intimacy could be a ritual, every climax a message to the gods, every position a form of sacred prayer. In this worldview, the line between faith and desire, between duty and indulgence, vanished completely. And behind that cosmic power, there was always a darker side. Children born into the highest ranks of society often grew up trapped in a world where their bodies were treated as sacred property of the state and the gods. Household slaves endured ongoing sexual exploitation that was not only tolerated but viewed as a religious obligation. And when disaster struck, when the Nile failed to rise or the fields withered, these practices became even more frenzied, desperate, and brutal. The turning point in our understanding didn't come from some grand tomb robbery or dramatic dig in the desert, but from a quiet examination room in 1925. Howard Carter's team was conducting the first close study of Tutankhamen's mummy when they made a discovery that would haunt Egyptology for decades. The young king's genitals were gone, not destroyed by decay, not damaged by time, but removed entirely, with the precise cuts of an experienced surgeon. The incisions were sharp, deliberate, and clearly made shortly after death as part of the embalming process. And Tutankhamun's case was not unique. As more royal mummies were analyzed with improved techniques, a grim pattern began to surface. Several pharaohs and nobles showed evidence of genital removal or alteration. Some had been fully castrated. Others revealed signs of enhancement procedures involving foreign materials placed inside the body. The most disturbing find came from the burial of an unnamed prince of the 18th dynasty. His remains didn't just lack genitals. The forensic evidence suggested they had been removed while he was still alive. Bone and tissue analysis pointed to a controlled, intentional operation, not an accident or punishment, but a calculated ritual act. Suddenly, ancient Egyptian writings took on a chilling clarity. Passages spoke of making the dead more perfect for the afterlife, of preparing bodies for eternal service to the gods, and of altering the deceased to ensure their spiritual duties could be fulfilled beyond the grave. The implications were enormous. If altering the genitals of the dead was common practice, what did it reveal about Egyptian views on sex, the body, and power? Were these modifications strictly after death, or did they mirror procedures carried out on the living? And perhaps most unsettling of all was the way Victorian archaeologists had buried the truth. When early Egyptologists came across explicit sexual art or clear evidence of such alterations, they didn't simply look the other way, they erased it. Artifacts vanished into private collections, and official reports were quietly edited to remove any mention of what had been found. For over a century, the full scope of Egypt's intimate customs was hidden, not by ancient secrecy, but by the moral restrictions of later eras, particularly the Victorian age, which could not accept what the evidence revealed. And the discovery of altered remains in royal burials was only the beginning. Archaeologists uncovered that Egypt's system of control over personal life worked through a strict hierarchy that shaped every aspect of relationships and private conduct. At the top were the pharaohs, whose personal vitality was believed essential for the stability of the kingdom. Beneath them, nobles and priests faced pressure to prove their devotion through ceremonial roles and public displays tied to religious belief. At the bottom were domestic servants, including the most vulnerable, who endured exploitation under the guise of sacred tradition. For children born into royal households, the future could be especially grim. Ancient writings describe how the youngest members of elite families were sometimes given to temple service, where they underwent rigorous preparation for roles within religious ceremonies. From an early age, they were taught that their bodies were not their own, but dedicated to divine purposes. This training was harsh and demanding. It required learning formalized movements, ceremonial positions, and methods to endure long rituals without showing fatigue. They were expected to suppress personal discomfort and view themselves as instruments of worship. Ancient medical records reveal the toll. Lasting injuries from repetitive strain, impaired growth from controlled diets intended to maintain a specific appearance. Many did not survive into adulthood due to the physical demands placed upon them. Beyond temple walls, wealthy households often misused their authority over servants, with the youngest sometimes being the most sought after due to social beliefs about innocence and obedience. Surviving legal documents confirm that young attendants could be traded between households for roles involving personal service, with value based on age, appearance, and level of preparation. Those who reached adulthood often carried deep psychological wounds, the kind modern psychology would classify as severe trauma. Many of these children struggled for the rest of their lives. They often found it difficult to build healthy relationships, some developing compulsive behaviors while others withdrew entirely from social life. Ancient texts refer, in delicate terms, to many dying young from what they called broken hearts. Perhaps most troubling was the way all of this was justified through religion. Priests taught that serving the gods in this way was the highest form of devotion, and that those chosen were honored, not harmed. Families were urged to take pride when their children were selected for temple duties, even when they understood the reality of what those duties entailed. There was also a financial side to this system. Evidence suggests extremely high mortality rates among temple children, with records of ceremonial procedures lasting many hours. Wealthy patrons paid enormous sums for access to young attendants, fueling an organized system of exploitation that endured for centuries. And yet, as dark as this was, it was not the most extreme practice in ancient Egypt. What came during the Feast of Drunkenness made everything else pale in comparison. This infamous religious festival stood apart as the height of Egypt's extremes, and what early archaeologists found shocked them so deeply that they destroyed some records rather than make them public. The event mixed religious ritual with unrestrained chaos on a scale that is hard to imagine today. Entire cities descended into days of frenzied celebration, where normal order dissolved into lawlessness. Archaeological evidence confirms that what ancient writings describe is not myth, it happened, just as the sources claim. Before we step further into this chapter of history, take a moment to like the video if you're ready for what's coming next, and share where in the world you're listening from. It's remarkable to see how curiosity about history's darkest corners connects people across the globe. The Feast of Drunkenness was dedicated to the goddess Hathor and celebrated once a year. What began as a joyous tribute to divine femininity gradually became something that, by today's standards, would be condemned worldwide. The festival's origins trace back to the legend of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who nearly wiped out humanity in her fury. According to myth, the gods stopped her by flooding Egypt with beer tinted red to resemble blood, leading her to drink until she became too intoxicated to continue, and transformed into the gentler Hathor. This story became the blueprint for an annual celebration in which people were encouraged to drink to excess, seeking a state of what they believed to be divine possession. Acts of excess were framed as sacred rituals. Violence was reinterpreted as a holy offering, and even the mistreatment of the vulnerable was described as divine favor. Foreign accounts reveal how shocking these celebrations appeared to outsiders. Mesopotamian envoys wrote of the festival as proof that Egypt's grandeur concealed a deeply chaotic culture. Some neighboring kingdoms went so far as to forbid their diplomats from traveling to Egypt during the festival period, citing concerns for both safety and morality. The aftermath could be as damaging as the event itself. Many participants awoke with no memory of their actions, only to be confronted later with evidence that caused deep personal and family rifts. Entire households were torn apart when relatives learned what had happened during the days of unrestrained celebration. Children born 9 months after the festival often carried a stigma, viewed as products of divine possession rather than ordinary conception. Economically, the disruption was severe. For an entire week, cities virtually shut down. Fields went untended, workshops closed, and government offices ceased to function. The loss in productivity was enormous, but pharaohs saw the festival as essential to preserving cosmic harmony. The event also had a political function. It served as a carefully timed release valve for social pressure, allowing a temporary reversal of the established order. For a brief period, citizens could defy authority, servants could openly mock masters, and the rigid hierarchy could be turned upside down, but only within the safe boundaries of this controlled chaos. Archaeological studies have confirmed the extreme nature of these gatherings. Excavations at temple sites have uncovered specialized rooms apparently intended for group rites, some bearing signs that they were linked to aggressive or degrading activities. These findings align with the troubling descriptions left in ancient writings. The gradual dismantling of such practices began during the Ptolemaic era, when Greek rulers attempted to reshape Egypt's religious customs according to Mediterranean ideals, curbing the most radical aspects of its ceremonial culture. Acts of excess were framed as sacred rituals. Violence was reinterpreted as a holy offering, and even the mistreatment of the vulnerable was described as divine favor. Foreign accounts reveal how shocking these celebrations appeared to outsiders. Mesopotamian envoys wrote of the festival as proof that Egypt's grandeur concealed a deeply chaotic culture. Some neighboring kingdoms went so far as to forbid their diplomats from traveling to Egypt during the festival period, citing concerns for both safety and morality. The aftermath could be as damaging as the event itself. Many participants awoke with no memory of their actions, only to be confronted later with evidence that caused deep personal and family rifts. Entire households were torn apart when relatives learned what had happened during the days of unrestrained celebration. The clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian sexual mysticism created a crisis that ultimately destroyed both systems. The Ptolemies, despite being foreign rulers, felt compelled to participate in Egyptian religious festivals to maintain legitimacy with their subjects. But their Greek sensibilities were horrified by the extreme sexual practices they encountered. Cleopatra I attempted to modify the Feast of Drunkenness, reducing its duration and imposing limits on the violence and public sexuality. These reforms triggered a religious crisis. Egyptian priests argued that modifying the festival would anger the gods and bring cosmic disaster. They pointed to natural disasters, military defeats, and economic problems as evidence that the gods were already displeased with foreign interference in sacred traditions. The crisis reached its peak during the reign of Cleopatra VII, who faced the impossible task of satisfying both Egyptian religious expectations and Roman political demands. Roman observers were scandalized by Egyptian sexual practices, viewing them as evidence of barbarism and moral decay. But Egyptian priests threatened rebellion if traditional festivals were abandoned entirely. Cleopatra's solution was to create private versions of the festivals for Egyptian religious leaders, while presenting a more modest public face to Roman audiences. This compromise satisfied no one and created a culture of hypocrisy that undermined both Egyptian religious authority and Roman political control. The abuse of children became even more systematic during this period, as desperate rulers tried to prove their devotion to Egyptian traditions while hiding the evidence from Roman oversight. Child slaves were trafficked in larger numbers, their abuse conducted in secret chambers that Roman officials were not allowed to enter. The psychological toll on Egyptian society was enormous. Generations of children had been raised in a system that normalized sexual violence and religious extremism. When external pressure forced changes to these practices, many Egyptians experienced a form of cultural trauma. They had lost not just religious traditions, but their entire framework for understanding sexuality and divine relationship. The final collapse came with the Roman conquest in 30 BCE. Augustus Caesar was horrified by what his forces discovered in Egyptian temples and immediately ordered the suppression of sexual religious practices. The renowned Ebers Papyrus, one of the most significant medical documents from ancient Egypt, contains over 40 sections devoted to intimate practices, many of which were not translated until the 1970s. Perhaps most startling is the record of deliberate destruction of evidence. British archaeologist Flinders Petrie openly wrote about destroying artifacts he considered too explicit for public display. In his own journals, Petrie described burning papyri, breaking statues, and reburying objects that portrayed acts he refused to document. This culture of suppression extended into academia. Universities avoided funding research into ancient Egyptian intimacy, deeming it inappropriate for formal study. Students who pursued the subject were discouraged, and sometimes removed from their programs. Scholarly journals refused to publish papers on the topic, even when backed by strong archaeological evidence. Museums developed elaborate systems to conceal explicit materials. The British Museum alone holds more than 2,800 Egyptian artifacts kept in restricted storage, often mislabeled as generic pottery or decorative items. As recently as 2019, the Louvre faced criticism for keeping newly discovered papyri out of public view. Even some online resources remain locked from public editing on these subjects. Visitors who specifically request access to such items face numerous bureaucratic hurdles intended to limit casual viewing. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York follows similar practices. Its Egyptian galleries display only edited versions of tomb paintings, with explicit details removed or digitally obscured. The original works remain in secure archives, available only to researchers who can prove a legitimate scholarly purpose and agree to strict confidentiality rules. Even today, this Victorian-era approach continues to shape how the public sees ancient Egypt. Popular documentaries and exhibitions tend to highlight politics, religion, and art, while ignoring the intimate customs that were deeply embedded in Egyptian culture. The result is a carefully cleaned version of history that often bears little resemblance to reality.